Picture the streets of Rome in the year 67 AD. Sunlight strikes the marble columns of the Forum, glinting off bronze statues of long-dead heroes. The air is thick with the smell of incense from nearby temples, mixed with the sweat of merchants hawking their wares. Citizens crowd the streets, pausing their business as a procession emerges, Emperor Nero himself, parading in full imperial splendor. But their eyes are not fixed on him, they're fixed on the figure at his side. Draped in silks, adorned with gems imported from the edges of the empire, the young figure appears every inch the empress, yet whispers ripple through the crowd like a cold wind. The woman walking beside the emperor is no woman at all. It is Sporus, a boy, reshaped and renamed, forced to embody Nero's dead wife. What the people are witnessing is not a love story, but a grotesque theater of power, grief, and madness. And behind the spectacle lies one of the most disturbing transformations in Roman history. But to understand how such a nightmare could unfold, we must first return to Nero himself, the man whose passions could build theaters, or burn cities, whose love could inspire devotion, or destroy lives. Nero Claudius Caesar was not born a monster. At 16, when he first ascended to the throne, Rome held its breath with hope. Here was a youth descended from emperors, stepping into power at the dawn of his life. He cut taxes, funded games, and, most shockingly for an emperor, performed on stage as a singer and actor. Delighting the common people, the Senate, at first, tolerated his eccentricities. To many, it seemed as though a golden age might be dawning. But absolute power is corrosive. Nero soon discovered that being emperor meant existing in a world where no one could say no to him, where fear dictated every whisper, where suspicion shadowed every friendship. It was not long before the weight of power and the paranoia of betrayal began to twist him. He surrounded himself with flatterers, isolated himself from those who might contradict him, and sought meaning not in governance, but in art, spectacle, and pleasure. Some ancient writers, like Suetonius and Tacitus, describe him as a man divided, a performer trapped inside an emperor's body. On one hand, the people saw his charisma, his theatrical gestures, his voice on the stage. On the other, his inner circle saw the mercurial rages, the deep insecurity, and the obsession with controlling not only the empire but the people closest to him. At the center of his desires stood one woman, Poppaea Sabina. She was dazzling, ambitious, sharp-tongued, and dangerously alluring. To Nero, she was more than a mistress, she was the embodiment of beauty, status, and eternal glory, and through her, Nero's love turned into something darker, obsession. Poppaea represented everything Nero's first wife, Octavia, did not. Octavia had been a dutiful bride, the daughter of the previous emperor Claudius, bound to Nero in a political marriage devoid of warmth. She was quiet, reserved, the kind of woman who preferred to disappear into the background of Rome's brutal court. Poppaea was the opposite, vibrant, commanding, and intoxicating. She drew attention as naturally as a flame draws moths. Nero, still a young emperor eager to define himself, fell under her spell. But this was no ordinary infatuation. It was a hunger that consumed him. He lavished her with gifts so extravagant they strained the treasury, pearls from the Red Sea, silks from China carried along the Silk Road, amber from the Baltic. Guards shadowed her every step, less to protect her than to make certain no other man's eyes lingered too long. Ancient historians describe how Nero's jealousy ignited into fury at the smallest slight, how he would explode if another dared compliment her, or if she herself showed the faintest independence. This obsession reshaped the empire. He divorced Octavia despite her popularity with the Roman people, exiled her, and later ordered her execution. Then, in a wedding of dazzling excess, he married Poppaea. For Nero, she was no mere wife, she was an idol, a goddess of his own making. He ordered portraits, statues, and busts of her to be placed in his palaces so that he would never be without her image. He demanded courtiers treat her with reverence, as if she were already divine. He would spend hours simply watching her, drinking in her presence like a man starved. And yet, for all her beauty and cunning, Poppaea was not meek. She challenged Nero when others cowered. She critiqued his decisions, mocked his performances, and stood her ground in a court where silence was survival. Perhaps that is why he loved her so fiercely, because she dared to push back. But this was also the flaw that would seal her fate. By 65 AD, the cracks in Nero's soul were widening. The emperor, once a hopeful symbol of renewal, had become erratic, paranoid, and consumed by his passions. And when tragedy struck, when his love for Poppaea collided with his violence, the consequences would not only shatter his own life, but drag a young boy named Sporus into a nightmare he could never escape. For now, the citizens in the forum could only watch in silence as their emperor passed. Hand in hand with his empress, they whispered in horror, but they did not speak too loudly. For in Rome, the line between truth and performance was no longer clear, and to contradict the emperor's fiction was to risk one's life. What began as a hopeful reign had already descended into madness, and it was only the beginning. Nero's love for Poppaea Sabina was unlike anything Rome had seen before. In the ancient world, emperors often had mistresses and even multiple wives. But what Nero felt for Poppaea went far beyond desire. It was a storm of infatuation, insecurity, and hunger for control. To him, she was not just a woman but a living symbol of beauty and power, an extension of his own imperial glory. And yet, in this fragile union of passion and possession, lay the seeds of disaster. When Nero first brought Poppaea into his life, the Roman court buzzed with scandal. She was already married when their affair began. But in Rome, such matters rarely shocked anyone. Adultery was a pastime of the elite, whispered about but tolerated. What unsettled the Senate and the people was not the affair itself but the depth of Nero's obsession. He showered Poppaea with treasures, silks dyed in Tyrian purple, so costly that only emperors could afford them, strings of pearls worth the income of entire provinces, exotic animals and perfumes brought from as far as Arabia and India. Each gift was a proclamation. She was not merely his wife, she was his world. Yet obsession breeds control. Poppaea could not breathe without Nero's watchful eyes. He stationed guards at her side not for her safety but to ensure no man dared look at her too long. Even friends and family were gradually kept away. Nero wanted her entirely for himself. Her every gesture, every word, every glance belonging to him alone. Ancient historians describe how he would sit for hours simply watching her move. As if she were not a human being but a possession, a beautiful object that existed solely for his pleasure. For a time, Poppaea wielded this obsession to her advantage. She was no naive girl plucked from obscurity, she was sharp, ambitious, and politically astute. She used Nero's devotion to secure favors for her allies, expand her influence, and raise her family's standing. Yet she was no mere schemer, she also possessed the boldness to speak her mind. A rare trait in the imperial court where a wrong word could mean exile or death. This boldness became her greatest strength and her greatest danger. Poppaea was unafraid to challenge Nero when she believed he was being foolish. She mocked his singing performances when they failed to impress, questioned his policy decisions, and even dared to argue with him in private. While others cowered and flattered, she confronted him. For a man intoxicated by power but terrified of losing control, such defiance was both intoxicating and intolerable. The breaking point came in 65 AD. The details differ depending on which ancient chronicler you trust, but all versions end in tragedy. Some claim the quarrel began when Nero returned late from a chariot race, drunk on victory and wine. Others say it was about his endless theatrical pursuits, his obsession with being seen as an artist rather than a ruler. Tacitus records that Poppaea, pregnant with their second child, reproached Nero for neglecting his duties as husband and emperor. In her condition, already weary from stress, she spoke too freely. Nero's rage was legendary, sudden and volcanic. In a fit of fury, he struck her, some say with his fists, others claim with a brutal kick to her stomach. The blow was fatal. Poppaea collapsed, her unborn child with her, and within hours she was dead. Imagine the silence in the imperial palace. The emperor, ruler of 60 million souls, stood over the lifeless body of the woman he claimed to love above all else. His power could command legions, build monuments, even change the course of rivers, but it could not undo the moment his own violence destroyed the one person he adored. The man who could never be contradicted had contradicted himself in the most irreversible way. What followed was a display of grief so excessive it became a grotesque theater in its own right. Ancient writers tell us that Nero flung himself upon Poppaea's body, begging forgiveness, screaming commands for her to live, as if even death must obey him. He summoned Rome's best physicians, threatening them with torture if they could not revive her. But medicine could not turn back time. Poppaea was gone, and yet Nero refused to let her go. He ordered her body embalmed rather than cremated, a violation of Roman custom, and entombed her in a shrine grander than that of many emperors. He declared her divine, establishing a cult in her honor. At court banquets, her seat was left empty, as if she might stroll in at any moment. Courtiers were expected to speak of her in the present tense, to act as if she still lived. To suggest otherwise was to risk exile, or worse. The emperor had slipped into a delusion where Poppaea's presence endured. Even in death, he spoke to her embalmed corpse, lavished it with perfumes and flowers, and demanded others participate in his fiction. Rome had seen emperors deify their predecessors. But this was something new. A man clinging so desperately to a ghost that he remade his world around her absence. And it was in this fragile, haunted space that Nero's gaze fell upon a boy. His name was Sporus, barely in his mid-teens. He was a freed youth of the imperial household, raised within the palace walls, educated for service, and utterly dependent on imperial favor. By fortune, or by curse, his face bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea's, the delicate features, the large expressive eyes, the same fragile beauty. For the grieving emperor, it was as though fate had offered him a miracle, a chance to reclaim what he had lost. But to make the illusion complete, Nero would demand something unspeakable. And Sporus, unknowing, had just stepped into the emperor's nightmare. Sporus was still little more than a boy when Nero's eyes fixed on him. Born into slavery within the imperial household, he had been manumitted at a young age, a privilege that, in theory, granted him freedom but in practice bound him even more tightly to the whims of his former masters. Freedmen in Rome lived in a paradox. They could rise to positions of wealth and influence, even surpassing the old aristocracy in power. But they owed everything to their patrons. Their survival depended on loyalty and usefulness. And if they ceased to please, they could be discarded as easily as broken pottery. For Sporus, the palace was the only world he had ever known. Raised among marble halls and perfumed gardens, he had been educated to serve, reading, writing, numbers, the basics of administration, compared to the millions of poor citizens and enslaved workers toiling in the fields. His life was privileged, but privilege in Rome was never security. It was a chain tied to the favor of the powerful. And then came the moment of recognition. To Nero, still reeling from Poppaea's death, Sporus was more than just a youth. He was an echo of the woman the emperor could not release. His resemblance to Poppaea, recorded by multiple ancient sources, was uncanny enough to feel like divine intervention. Romans believed that physical resemblance was more than coincidence, it hinted at shared essence. Perhaps even a spiritual bond. For Nero, it was as though the gods had returned Poppaea to him in another form. But there was one problem. Sporus was male. For an ordinary man, that would have been the end of it. But Nero was not ordinary, he was emperor. A man who had convinced himself that his power extended beyond laws, beyond customs, even beyond nature. He had spoken to corpses, commanded people to pretend the dead still lived. Now, he decided to correct nature itself. What followed was one of the most deliberate acts of cruelty in recorded history. Nero ordered his physicians to perform surgery on Sporus, transforming him into something that could pass as Poppaea reborn. In modern words, it was castration, but in the ancient world it was mutilation of the most dangerous kind. Roman surgical practice was primitive, closer to butchery than medicine. They had scalpels, hooks, forceps, and cauterizing irons. Anesthetics were limited to crude opiates or mandrake roots, barely enough to dull the agony. Infection was a constant threat. Even minor wounds could turn fatal. For a delicate and invasive procedure such as this, the survival rate was uncertain at best. Imagine the scene. Guards holding down the struggling boy. Physicians approaching with iron instruments. The smell of burning flesh as wounds were sealed with hot metal. Sporus had no voice in the matter. his cries would echo through the palace corridors. But none would dare intervene. The will of the emperor was law, and if the body survived, the soul would not remain unscathed. To be castrated in Rome was not simply a physical change. It was a social annihilation. Masculinity was the core of Roman identity, authority, honor, family lineage all depended on it. A man without the ability to father children was considered incomplete, even monstrous. Eunuchs were rare in Roman society and often treated with suspicion or derision. For Sporus, this meant not only the loss of his future but the erasure of his very self. Yet Nero was not content with mere surgery. The transformation was to be total. Sporus was dressed in the silks that had once adorned Poppaea, adorned with her jewels, and renamed Sabina, after the dead empress. He was instructed in the arts of womanhood, how to walk with grace, how to sit with modesty, how to move his hands delicately. Tutors trained his voice to soften, to rise in pitch, to echo feminine speech. Hairdressers curled and arranged his hair into elaborate styles, fixing them with pins of ivory and gold. Every lesson, every jewel, every mirror reflected the same brutal truth. Sporus was no longer permitted to exist as himself. His identity was being stripped away, replaced with a ghost. He was to become Poppaea, not a memory of her, not an image, but her living replacement. This was not devotion. It was domination masquerading as love. Nero's grief had turned into an obsession so total that he sought to resurrect the dead by destroying the living. And for Sporus, each day became a ritual of erasure. Consider the psychological torment. Waking in chambers decorated with Poppaea's likeness. Forced to wear her gowns. Forced to answer to her name. To speak, to move, to exist only as another person's shadow. Even gifts meant to adorn him, rings, necklaces, silks, were in truth shackles, each one binding him tighter to the role of a dead woman he had never chosen to imitate. The Romans, hardened to brutality, still whispered in disbelief, even in a society accustomed to excess. Nero's transformation of Sporus was seen as unprecedented, a grotesque twisting of nature. Yet no one dared oppose him openly. The empire bent around the emperor's delusion, and those in his orbit played their part. By the time Sporus emerged from this forced metamorphosis, he was no longer a boy but a living monument to Nero's madness. And the emperor, still not satisfied, prepared to seal the illusion with a ceremony that would shock even Rome's jaded elite: a wedding. Spring of 67 AD. The imperial palace in Rome glittered with unnatural splendor. The great halls were hung with garlands of imported flowers, their scent heavy in the air, mingling with incense and torch smoke. Bronze lamps cast golden light across marble floors polished to a mirror sheen. Musicians rehearsed soft hymns of matrimony. Courtiers, draped in togas woven with purple borders, murmured uneasily as they gathered. They knew what was about to happen, and though every instinct told them it was obscene, none dared to resist, for the emperor had declared that he would marry again. His bride was not a senator's daughter, not a foreign princess, not even a woman. It was Sporus, the boy Nero had mutilated, renamed, and remade into the image of Poppaea Sabina. The spectacle was staged with all the pomp of tradition. In Roman custom, weddings were sacred bonds meant to ensure family lineage, political stability, and continuity of legacy. Rituals included the joining of right hands, the offering of sacred bread, and the invocation of Juno, goddess of marriage. These symbols carried centuries of weight. Nero twisted them all. Where the empire expected fertility, there would be none. Where the Senate expected legitimacy, there was only delusion. Yet the forms of tradition were observed, as if their repetition could sanctify what everyone knew to be a grotesque parody. Sporus was led into the hall clad in shimmering garments tailored to disguise the body that nature had given him. Seamstresses had labored for months, cutting silks to flatter his slight frame, disguising sharpness with drapery. The emperor's jewelers placed necklaces around his throat, bracelets on his wrists, and a diadem of gold upon his head. Many of these ornaments had belonged to Poppaea herself. Every jewel was a reminder that Sporus was not to exist as himself but as the living shadow of the woman Nero had killed. His hair was curled and arranged in intricate styles that aristocratic women envied. Makeup softened his features, brightened his eyes, and painted his lips. To onlookers, He appeared fragile, doll-like, and eerily familiar. The court gasped, not because they believed the illusion, but because they were forced to accept it. In Rome, appearances were reality when commanded by the emperor. Then came Nero, draped in imperial robes of Tyrian purple, his face radiant with theatrical joy. He played his part with perfect conviction, smiling as if he were truly in love, as if the gods themselves had blessed him with a miracle. He joined hands with Sporus, recited vows, and shared the ritual bread. Priests intoned blessings while courtiers applauded with trembling hands. The legal documents were signed, the union declared official, and with that, Nero had taken as his wife a boy transformed into a ghost of the woman he had destroyed. The wedding banquet followed. Tables groaned with delicacies, roasted peacocks with gilded feathers, honey cakes shaped like doves, amphorae of wine older than the emperor himself. Musicians filled the hall with song, while dancers performed in gilded masks. Courtiers offered congratulations, pretending delight. Their smiles were painted on, their voices strained. They knew they were participants in something unnatural, but to protest would mean death. Better to play the role of witness in this grotesque performance. And so Sporus became Sabina, the empress of Rome. He was granted his own household, servants to attend him, and chambers within the palace adorned with luxuries beyond imagination. He traveled in a gilded litter carried by slaves, surrounded by guards, accompanied by attendants who addressed him as Augusta. On the surface, he had everything a Roman aristocrat could desire. But beneath the gold and silk was a life of unrelenting performance. Every day demanded perfection. At feasts, he sat at Nero's side, smiling in silent devotion, answering to Poppaea's name. At state functions, he played the role of imperial wife, nodding graciously, greeting envoys, accepting praise as though he had once been the woman whose memory haunted the emperor. In private, he endured a far crueler weight. Nero's insistence on treating him as though he truly were Poppaea. The emperor reminisced about memories that never happened, shared stories from a marriage that was never theirs, and demanded Sporus respond as if he remembered. Every word, every look, every gesture was a test. A mistake could mean exile, punishment, or worse. To survive, Sporus became a master of mimicry. Ancient sources suggest he grew skilled at anticipating Nero's moods, responding with uncanny precision, as though he had truly stepped into another's life. But the cost was crushing. Each mirror reminded him of what he had lost: his own face, his own name, his own future. Each gift he received reminded him that his existence was chained to the memory of a dead woman. It is hard to imagine the psychological torment of such a life. To be dressed in silks that once belonged to another. To wear jewelry that had once been warmed by another's skin. To walk, talk, and smile not as yourself but as a shadow of the emperor's obsession. Even in moments of silence, the fiction did not relent. Sporus's very breath was stolen from him, reshaped into someone else's. The court may have whispered in horror, but Rome itself remained silent. What could they do? The emperor was law, and if he declared a boy was an empress, then the empire would bend to that reality. For 2 years, Sporus lived not as himself but as Nero's ghostly bride. But the performance was not confined to Rome. Soon Nero would take his new wife abroad, displaying him to the world as the Empress of Rome. The illusion, already grotesque within the marble halls of the palace, would be carried to foreign shores, to Greece itself, the land of theater, where Nero would attempt to prove himself as artist and god. And for Sporus, the stage was only growing larger. By 67 AD, the grotesque illusion was complete. Sporus, now called Sabina, lived as the Empress of Rome. He rode beside Nero in a golden litter, received honors as Augusta, and stood at the emperor's side in public ceremonies. But behind the layers of silk and jewels was a life hollowed out by fear. Each day was a performance, each word rehearsed, each smile a mask. Nero's obsession had turned Sporus into both ornament and prisoner, a living doll forced to sustain the lie of a woman long dead. Yet even as the emperor played out his fantasy, the empire around him trembled. Nero's reign, once filled with promise, had devolved into chaos. His endless extravagance drained the treasury. His theatrical performances humiliated the dignity of Rome in the eyes of the Senate. Provinces groaned under taxation, and whispers of rebellion spread from Spain to Gaul to the eastern frontiers. When Nero announced a grand tour of Greece, it was less a political mission than a stage for his vanity. He fancied himself not merely an emperor but an artist, a singer, an actor, a competitor worthy of Greek laurels. He entered chariot races, recited poetry before packed amphitheaters, and demanded victory crowns in every contest. The Greeks, bound by diplomacy, declared him the finest performer of their age, though most privately despaired at the farce. And always, at his side, Sporus appeared in jeweled gowns, displayed as the Empress of Rome. Foreign dignitaries struggled to mask their bewilderment. Their conqueror paraded not with a queen but with a boy forced into her likeness. Back in Rome, patience had run thin. Governors raised banners of revolt. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, turned against him when bribes from his rivals outweighed their loyalty. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. For the first time in his life, Nero found himself alone. In June of 68 AD, Nero fled Rome with only a handful of attendants. Sporus was among them, even in flight, even in the shadow of death. Nero could not abandon the boy who represented Poppaea's ghost. They hid in a villa on the outskirts of the city as enemies closed in. Nero wept, raged, and fantasized about fleeing to Egypt or staging one final performance for posterity. But when news arrived that soldiers were approaching, he made his choice, refusing capture. The Emperor of Rome drove a dagger into his own throat, muttering, "What an artist dies in me." For Sporus, Nero's death should have meant release. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new nightmare. Now one of the most recognizable symbols of Nero's decadence, he became a prize to be claimed by powerful men scrambling for control. First, he fell into the hands of Nymphidius Sabinus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, who paraded him as though he were imperial property. When Sabinus fell, Sporus passed to Otho, one of the short-lived emperors who seized power in the year of the four emperors. Later, he was claimed by Vitellius. Each man treated him as Nero had, mocking his identity, calling him by Poppaea's name, forcing him to maintain the illusion. Sporus had ceased to exist as himself. He was an object passed from hand to hand, a trophy of shame. Under Vitellius, the final humiliation was planned. The new emperor, eager to entertain the mob, announced that Sporus would be brought into the amphitheater. There, before tens of thousands of roaring spectators, he would be cast in a cruel reenactment of the myth of Persephone, dragged into the underworld by Hades. Symbolizing his eternal role as the stolen bride, it would have been nothing less than public sexual degradation staged as myth. For Sporus, this was the breaking point. He had endured years of forced performance, of silks and jewels that cut deeper than chains, of living as the echo of a dead woman. But to face mockery and violation in the arena before the Roman mob was unbearable. For the first time in years, he seized a fragment of choice. He took his own life, most sources say by poison, before Vitellius could strip away the last shred of dignity he still possessed. He was perhaps no older than 20. And so Sporus died as he had lived under Nero, a victim of power. A ghost of another, a boy erased by the emperor's obsession. Yet in death, he made the one choice denied him in life. He refused the final humiliation. His suicide was both tragedy and defiance, a last assertion of agency in a world that had stolen everything else. The ancient historians who recorded his story, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, rarely spoke of Sporus as a person. To them, he was a symbol of imperial excess, an anecdote to illustrate the decadence of Rome's rulers. His voice, his thoughts, his dreams were never written down. Who was Sporus before Nero remade him? Did he dream of freedom, of love, of a quiet life beyond the palace walls? We will never know. History remembers him only as Nero's doll, his phantom empress. But if we listen closely, across 2 millennia, his story still whispers. It warns of the dangers of absolute power, of grief that curdles into madness, of how the ambitions of rulers can crush the lives of the powerless. More than that, it forces us to reckon with identity itself, what it means to be stripped of selfhood, to be forced into another's shadow. In the end, Sporus was neither emperor nor empress, neither slave nor free, but something far more tragic, a human being consumed by another's delusion. And in his final act, he claimed what little remained of his humanity. He chose not to be paraded, not to be mocked, not to be erased again. He chose the silence of death over the theater of cruelty. That silence still echoes, a reminder that behind every monument of empire, behind every name inscribed in marble, are lives broken and forgotten. And some, like Sporus, deserve to be remembered, not as symbols of decadence, but as human souls caught in the jaws of power.